The death of acclaimed actor Philip Seymour Hoffman has highlighted the rising problem of heroin abuse. Prescription drug abuse is on the rise, and heroin is seen as an easier and cheaper alternative. In the U.S., most of the heroin on this black market makes its way from Mexico, so it's a rising problem on the border. But heroin trafficking is also on the rise in Afghanistan. It was the topic of discussion today in a hearing on counter-narcotics operations in Afghanistan. Here is Aaron Logan from the Office of the Undersecretary of Defense describing the threat of Afghan heroin in the United States.
With the governor of Vermont issuing a State of the State speech focused entirely on Vermont's exploding heroin and opiate problem. We have to realize and be vigilant that there is a possibility that Afghan-produced heroin will become more available across the United States.
Well, the U.S. has spent billions of dollars in battling drugs in Afghanistan, but have there been any real results? To discuss, I'm joined now by Anthony Cordesman, the Arleigh A. Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome, Anthony. So the U.S. is getting ready to get out of Afghanistan, but we've seen a surge in violence lately. Much of it can be attributed to the opium industry. Can you elaborate on how drugs are fueling the unrest?
Well, if you mean unrest in Afghanistan, it's very unclear that this is a primary cause. What you have had is, as ISAF, that's the forces that are the allied forces, pull back, you have seen an uptake in Taliban activity against the Afghan forces. What you did see in the UN survey is that there's been a 50% increase in production in opium this year. And you've expanded the area under cultivation by nearly a third. Now, to the extent that there is always tension between the Afghan drug lords and power brokers, that kind of violence sort of goes on a steady level. But when you look at the actual farming of opium and the production of opium, getting it out of the farm gate, out of provinces like Helmand, that's not really a major cause of violence in the region.
Okay, but you mentioned a 50% increase in the production of opium. We've spent billions of dollars on fighting this and putting an end to this. How is it possible that so many resources have been directed at stopping it, yet we're seeing a rise of it being produced?
Well, you're talking about expenditures over 10 years in an extremely erratic program, one the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction feels has not been effective, one that the UN data indicates has had really very, very little real impact. What you see over time is not that these programs have had much impact, but for example, last year, people had originally predicted a much higher increase in production. What happened was the rains weren't very good. And to the extent there was any limitation on opium output, it had nothing to do with counter-drug programs. What you did do at one point was push the growth of opium out of the north, out of the east, where there was a much stronger troop presence, and into the south, where you had more Taliban control. But for example, last year, you saw areas that had been previously drug-free, at least according to the estimates, producing again. And as you see more and more troops pulled out of Afghanistan, and what, to be blunt, is a very corrupt police force be the only real barrier, you're almost certain to see a lot of those areas which were supposedly giving up drug production take up drug production again.
You had called it an erratic program, and it's an erratic program, to use your words, that has been an expensive program. Does that mean, should we keep funneling money into something that hasn't really seen results, or does the approach need to change?
Well, it's too late to change anything. You aren't going to have anybody there to make the program work. You do not have a police force which is capable of honestly really affecting the drug crop. You're going to be pulling aid workers and aid money out of the area. because of the vulnerability that Afghan farmers have to the rains, which can be extremely erratic, opium is still one of the most attractive crops to virtually any farmer. You watched a lot of the road system deteriorate over the last 2 years, and opium's easy to move. It's an area where farmers can get advanced loans, which they can't on normal commercial crops. So to be honest, the idea that you're going to have honest, meaningful eradication is simply not going to happen. And efforts to find substitute crops and persuade farmers to move into areas like wheat, while they've had some success in some areas, haven't worked in Helmand or the main drug-producing areas. And since we're going to have the aid workers out, the police advisors largely out, and military advisors largely out by the end of this year, and Afghans are going to have much less aid, you can pretty well predict what's going to happen to narcotics production.
Yeah, it sounds like as long as there's an incentive to create that crop, that it's going to keep happening. We don't have that much time, but I want to ask you, we're seeing all these outside resources directing to stopping this program. Do you think that change, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen within Afghanistan itself?
It's going to happen within Afghanistan, and virtually every political, security, and economic force is going to push the Afghans back toward more drug production as soon as ISAF forces leave at the end of this year.
Very interesting what's happening over there, and appreciate you, sir, weighing in on it. That was Anthony Cordesman, the Arleigh A. Burke Chair in Strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies.